course, it was not so exclusively directed toward the keyboard, as Clark and the group demonstrated last night. Last year, we were treated to a violin, mandolin, guitar rendition by the Etcetera string band, of which Dennis Pash is a member. And if he had so much interest, we decided to bring Dennis back to tell us more about such instrumental combinations.
Okay, most of the stuff that's been written about ragtime always deals with it from the point of view of a piano. But throughout the ragtime era, it was played on just about every instrument you can think of, including accordion, marimba, xylophone, piccolo, saxophone, harmonica, and a wide variety of string instruments. So I'm going to talk about some of the string instruments. Technically, of course, the piano is a string instrument. Since the sound comes from groups of strings which are struck by hammers, the only difference is you push a key and that works it. And on most string instruments, you actually do that yourself with either a pick or your fingers. Or sometimes you hold the hammers in your hand, depending on the instrument. Touched a little bit on some of the things that Clark was talking about for those of you who may not have been here. I'm going to start off with the banjo. I have to get through this like a bat out of hell to get it all in here. Thank you. Okay, as far as we know, the banjo is an African instrument, derived from African instruments. The first documentation in the New World that we found in 1678, Caribbean French island of Martinique, and the first documentation in the United States in 1774, in Maryland and Virginia, where it's actually referred to as a banjo. It was focused from one of the slaves on the plantations. They made them out of the materials that they had at hand, and probably the first whites to play it were whites that lived on the plantations. And then it occurred to somebody that they could present slave culture in a theatrical form and use it as popular entertainment. That's where the Virginia minstrels come along and they start to popularize it. That was Dan Emmett's group who wrote Dixie. He had a four-man group. It was banjo, fiddle, bones, and tambourine. These were all slave folk instruments. And other people popularized it, and then we get into the ragtime era. This is kind of the typical plantation slave idea. I don't know if this guy really was a slave or if he just posed for this, but it's a good picture, you gotta admit. Also, to give you an idea of just how prevalent these string instruments were in those days, there's an old story, I can't remember where I heard it, but when they used to go out possum hunting, and they'd tree a possum with their dogs, and somebody would climb up in the tree and shake the branch to try and knock the possum down. Well, supposedly that when they'd do this, before the possum fell down, first a fiddle or a banjo would fall down. I haven't found any possum ragtime yet. As soon as I find some animal ragtime, I'll suggest it for a seminar, and we'll do that. Okay, the two most popular ragtime banjo players. Bess Osman, he was a contemporary of Scott Joplin's exact contemporary. He's probably more closely folk-oriented. If you listen to his recordings, he doesn't play exactly like the music. He incorporates a lot of his own stuff. In fact, some pieces sound as if he learned them by ear. Fred Van Epps is the other one. This is nobody who was very popular, but this is Myrtle Stump, and she was a female tenor banjo player. I found her folio in a used bookstore in Glendale. It was published in Los Angeles in 1916, and it's got several rags in it that she composed, arranged for 2 tenor banjos. So they were playing ragtime on the tenor banjo, at least by the teens, and there were women banjos too, so that's why I included her. I quite Galen, he wanted to use this one too. So James Reese Europe's group, this is like a banjo orchestra. There's lots of different banjo type instruments, based essentially just using the head idea to produce the sound. James Reese Europe also had a huge mandolin orchestra, and recently in New York they tried to recreate that. I think Bob Alt was there, and he can tell you more about that. Bess Osman went to England very early on, 1900. This is a poster for his appearance there. He also appeared with a prominent mandolin player, Samuel Siegel of the time, and he influenced the British in the banjo. And this is interesting because it really caught on there more so than you can hear. More recordings were made of British banjoists, and the King of England at that time even played the banjo. And that popularized it a lot. And to this day, there's more of a tradition of the 5-string classic banjo in England than there probably is here. Some of the finest players are over there. I don't know why. I think they should bring some of them over here to the Ragtime Festival sometime. Move on to the fiddle. The fiddle is a very universal type of instrument. It's found all over the world. Africa, Asia, Central, South America, the Caribbean, Canada, different versions, folk versions, 1-string fiddles in Africa. The folk versions here usually are made from either a corn stalk or a cigar box or something like that. I've got more documentation on ragtimers that played the violin than anything else. Among some of the big names were Carrie Mills, Sadie Kaninsky. I wanted to use that slide too, but couldn't get that. J. Bodewalt Lampy, Will Marion Cook, Wilbur Sweatman. He's better known as a clarinetist, but he was a fiddler too. Clarence M. Jones, Arthur Pryor, better known as a trombonist, but he also played the violin. Charles L. Johnson, in an interview, once listed his 2 main instruments as the violin and the piano. A popular person from the time who was not a ragtimer was John Philip Sousa. He was first a violinist also. And according to Ed Berlin, Joplin played the violin and advertised as a violin teacher in a newspaper. There was a popular vaudeville act called the Jockers Brothers, Albert and Monroe Jockers, that recorded 78s back in those days. I had a lot of examples I was going to play, but I don't think there's time for all of them. So, of course, Irving Berlin wrote a popular song called The Ragtime Violin, which some of you may know from the movie The Easter Parade, where Fred Astaire and Judy Garland do it as a little routine. It's the one that goes fiddle up on your violin, you know, all that. And this guy here is Bill Driver. He was a black Missouri fiddler. There's lots of documented black fiddlers from Missouri. He was born in the 1870s, and he apparently did play some ragtime, though none of the recordings that I've heard by him contain any ragtime, but I just used him as kind of a typical example because there aren't too many photos of Missouri black fiddlers. I'll move on to the mandolin. The early mandolins had kind of a bowl shape that's more like a lute, which is popularly known as tater bug mandolin. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that type of bug, but it does resemble somewhat that bug. There was a whole family of mandolin instruments also. This is just an unknown duet of 2 black players, but it's probably fairly typical of the time. This is one of the probably 2 most popular mandolinists of the era. This is Valentine Apt, and he made a lot of 78s with the guitarist. And the other one was Samuel Siegel, who went over to England with Bess Osman. And I don't have a picture of him, but he doesn't look too different from this. picture is interesting. It's an unknown mandolinist, but what's interesting about it is that we can see the sheet music that he's learning from. And one of the pieces is Put On Your Old Gray Bonnet, and there's an Indian intermezzo in there. But the point of this is that just because things were published for certain instruments, that doesn't mean that that's what instruments actually played then. It seems like the standard publication for any type of piece has always been the piano. Even today, when they don't even use pianos anymore, they still come out with these piano arrangements of pop songs. So I don't think we can always tell too much from that end. This is just a typical of the folios that were issued at the time of mandolin music. You'd have a book that would have the mandolin parts and a book with the guitar parts. There's a mandolin version of Dill Pickles. It's essentially the top line of the piano version. They didn't use many harmonies or double stops in these pieces, except maybe at the very ends of themes. Some famous ragtimers played the mandolin. This is Theron Bennett's Mandolin Orchestra at Pierce City, Missouri in the 1890s. That alfalfa-looking character on the right is Theron Bennett. He was in his teens at the time. This is Walton Mandolin Club. This features Charles L. Johnson over there on the right with the mandolin. He wrote the Dill Pickles Rag, and this, as far as we know, this group here, this is from the 1895 or so. There was a whole collection published, written by the members of this band, and it includes the earliest Charlie Johnson compositions, none of which are ragtime, but there's a couple of marches and something called the Eskimo Dance and things like that. Okay, in about the late 19th and early 20th century, it seems like the coolest instrument you could play was the mandolin, sort of like electric guitar became later. And so there were all these mandolin organizations and clubs, they call them. If you find any old yearbook from that period and open it up to the music section, you're sure to see pictures of mandolin clubs that are so prevalent. This is just, I offer this just as a typical example. This is Myron Hole's orchestra from Wichita, Kansas. Also, when we first started getting into this, we met a mandolin player who had played in string bands. He had a group with his brother at one time. His name was Andy Jenkins, and they played under the name the Jenkins Brothers. And they had recorded a 78 of the black and white rag. In the old days, some of the music stores had recording facilities, and they had gone into the one at Jenkins. And so we talked to him, and we've got an example. I chose an example of some of the rags that he played. This is one that it's definitely a folk rag. It's got the circle of fifths in it. It's got a lot of strange themes from here and there. Another interesting thing is when we were talking to him, I thought it was interesting the way he referred to all these pieces. He was talking about them as if they were like old friends of his. Like when Red Wing was a piece he played, he'd go, "Oh yeah, good old Red Wing. That's a good old piece, Red Wing." Yeah, we talked about that also. I left a little bit of that in too. So here's one of his rags, if I can find it on here.
Wish I could figure that down home rag. It's a good old rag. Go from there. Oh, we just called it the minor rag.
He said they called that the minor rag, which I thought was strange since I don't think there's even any minor chords in there, but... Okay, move on to the guitar. This is nobody special. His name is J.B. Gallagher. He was a teacher of string instruments in Carthage, Missouri, and he worked for Dumars, who was James Scott's publisher. But there's different guitars that were used, and you look at this guitar, maybe some of you have seen them, they have like an extra set of strings on them. Well, that's a harp guitar, and they were commonly used back then. Some of you, in fact, may have seen Bob Alt around here with his. He's about the only person I know that has one. But what they are, they have an extra set of bass strings, and so for a guitar or mandolin duet or a band that didn't have a bass, that would add a little more bottom. You would reach down and strike a bass string and go up to the chord, or if you were skilled enough, you could play octaves by playing the bass string and the lower bass string on the sixth string part of the guitar and get a fuller sound. So that's what those are, if you ever wondered. Whistling Rufus, a very popular tune at the time about a black guitarist who was a one-man band. Here's a famous ragtime that played the guitar. Henry Fillmore, who was best known for his trombone smear rags. He wrote about 14 of them. This is him at the military academy over there on the left, playing the guitar. Move on to some oddball instruments here. The harp is one that actually had ragtime played on it, and this is virtually the epitome of the harp. Ragtime harp. This is Lyons and Yasko, composers of the spaghetti rag. The vaudeville team mandolin harp. This is interesting because this is a picture of a minstrel group, but they've got all string instruments and they even include a harp in there. This is Uncle Bones Margate Minstrels. Hawaiian ragtime. Another instrument that ragtime was played on is the steel guitar or Hawaiian guitar. Now, it's always been called the steel guitar, but originally it wasn't played on guitars made of steel or anything. They're just regular guitars. And a Hawaiian who's generally credited with inventing it is named Joseph Kakuku, who was a man that around the turn of the century in Hawaii. He was walking down a railroad track with his guitar strapped to his back, and the strap broke and it fell off and it slid along the railroad track, and it gave him the idea to start playing like that. He used different things and eventually made his own metal bar to bar the strings. And ragtime seems to have been played pretty early in Hawaii. We forget sometimes that Ben Harney actually toured over there. And there was a ragtime pianist named Sonny Kunha who wrote some ragtime songs and apparently some rags over there. But this is Pauli Kelua and David Kaili, who were a popular Hawaiian guitar duet at the time. They made lots of records, and many of these records, even if they're not actual rags, feature lots of syncopation. They're played in a ragtime style, and in some cases they've actually assembled a bunch of pieces and just syncopated them, put them together in a typical ragtime style. This is the Royal Hawaiian Quartet. They played at the Panama Pacific Exposition in San Francisco in 1915 and helped popularized the Hawaiian guitar there. Prior to that, there had been a Broadway show called The Bird of Paradise, which was set in Hawaii, and they decided for authentic effect that they would get real Hawaiian musicians to be in it, which they did, and no one had ever heard stuff like that. It caught on, became very popular. Plus, this group helped to popularize it too. And the steel guitarist in this group also wrote and published the first steel guitar book, which was published by Sherman Clay in San Francisco. This guy's name is George E.K. Awahi. That's the book, the folio, and inside it included some ragtime, such as this ragtime song by Sonny Kunha. Also had Kohala March, which is a typical Hawaiian piece that's played a lot, that's syncopated almost like a rag. Yes, this has the style that this was written in. On the top, they gave you the actual melody line, and on the bottom is what they call tablature, which is actually almost used exclusively today for string instruments. What it does is that the 6 lines represent the 6 strings of the guitar, and they have numbers corresponding to the notes, which would be the frets that you would play, that would correspond to those notes in the music. So you can see the music and see where to put the bar on the strings to play it. They also had, naturally, with the tune, you would have an open tuning on the A tuning was the most common. And of course it was hard to get some of those harmonies, so they invented ways like turning the bar just a little bit crooked to get certain harmonies, which is kind of a lost art because now they have like pedal steels to do all that stuff for you. This guy was a Hawaiian player too. I put him in because, well, he was a great mandolin player from Hawaii. He was known as a mandolin virtuoso when he played ragtime, and I mainly include him because he was also a ukulele virtuoso. And he wrote the first ukulele folio method, and it included ragtime in it, ragtime syncopations and how to play ragtime. Which brings us to string band, which is the combination of various instruments together. This is one of the earliest pictures known of more than one instrument, string instrument, being played together. This is like an old genre painting from about 1838 that shows a black dance. And there's like 3 instruments, cello, fiddle, and fife, I think. This is a group from New Orleans. String instruments were used in all different types of combinations. Plus, they were used in combinations with other instruments. Fifes and different types of flutes and accordions, and actually just about anything you could name would be combined. The term string band, according to Oxford English Dictionary, first documentation is in England in 1860, where they had regimental groups, bands. These are brass bands, but they would have subordinate groups made up of the same members that could play string instruments that would play for different functions where they would prefer string music, probably smaller places. And so they just commonly referred to them as string bands to designate them apart from the brass bands. And apparently this also was picked up in the United States around the time of the Civil War and became a common term for any group of string musicians. As it's actually been used, it's been used to refer to anything from 2 people, like a banjo and fiddle duet, on up to huge, large groups. This is interesting. Some of you have probably seen this picture before. It's a black string band, turn of the century, and they're playing at a white function. This is one of the few that gives you an idea of some of the types of things these groups actually played for, and what they actually look like. It's not known, as far as I know, who these people are or where it was. New York? Really? you know what, New York, or New York State, what? Okay. Oh, okay. Just another typical combination of the time. I think this is from Alabama. This picture is interesting because along with the string instruments, they have a tambourine player and a bone player, which shows the connection to minstrel music. This is a medicine show band from Colorado, and it's quite possible that the string band tradition as we know it owes a lot to the minstrel shows, the early minstrel shows. Another group, and another instrument I'd like to talk about briefly is the cello. The cello was used in ragtime, but not as a solo instrument. Mainly it was used as a bass in string bands. Of course, the stand-up bass was used also, but I think of all the pictures I've looked at, I've seen more cellos. And I guess a logical reason for this might be because it's easier to carry around than the big one. Another interesting thing about the cellos is that in every picture I've looked at, with maybe one possible exception, the cello only has between 2 and 3 strings on it. It doesn't have 4 strings. And I would think maybe the reason for that would be they didn't need it because they were using it to play bass. They didn't need the high string. It's always the high string that's missing. And also, country musicians frequently pronounced it cello instead of cello. Another important thing is that any types of the basses that would have been played with these groups would have been bowed rather than plucked like we do nowadays. That didn't seem to come along until the 20s. There might have been a few enterprising individuals who experimented with it, but virtually every photograph I've seen has the bow and the recordings as well, at least the early ones. Another typical group at a function, I think this is in New York. This is an important group. This is the East Texas Serenaders. And in fact, we have a man here who's responsible for any of us knowing anything about them. That's Fred Hepner, who actually managed to interview the fiddle player in this group back in the 50s when he was still alive. This group probably played and recorded more ragtime than any other string band, and it was very authentic sounding ragtime also. It's strange about the state of Texas. It seems to be very heavy ragtime territory. We sometimes forget Scott Joplin was born in Texas, and of course Uday Bowman, like their two rags, like start and ended the ragtime era. And a lot of ragtime seems to have come out of there. Other interesting thing is that Texas has a lot of German influence, a lot of German people there, and so does Missouri. And I don't think anyone's ever really talked about the ethnic influences on ragtime other than the black influence. I think it would be definitely something to go into because there's definite things. A couple examples are that I know of. Percy Wenrich, who of course was of German descent. There's a piece of his called Noodles, which we recorded with my group, the Etcetera String Band. You can get it at the Ragtime store. The first theme of this is simply an old German waltz that's put into ragtime. It's one that some of you may know from an old Playtex diaper commercial from the 60s. It's a tune called Du lieber Augustine or something like that. It's a waltz. In fact, Morten Gunnar Larsen told me he knew it as a Swedish piece. It incorporates a definite piece of ethnic music. Another example is Carrie Mills' piece Impecunious Davis, which incorporates an Irish hornpipe, which is called the Humours of Tully Crean or something like that. But all the parts are in the first theme of Impecunious Davis, and that's another interesting thing about Carrie Mills. He's an important figure. He was a fiddler, and more of his pieces have entered the string tradition and are used to this day than anyone else. George Camp Meeting is one, Whistling Rufus, and a non-ragtime piece, Red Wing, which you all know. I tried to compile a list of some of the most frequently played rags on string instruments, and what I came up with was interesting because, well, the Georgia Camp Meeting, Whistling Rufus, St. Louis Tickle, Dill Pickles, Black and White Rag, Down Home Rag. All of these people, except for the possible exception of George Bochford, which nobody seems to know anything about, all played string instruments. And these pieces have all entered the string repertoire and are played to this day. Of course, a lot of them are played by jazz bands and ragtime pianists also. This group is important because, as far as we know, this group has the first instance of the term string band being used on a record label. This is Lovey's Trinidad String Band. They were from Trinidad. They also appear to have been the first black string band to record in about 1912, I believe. And the pieces they played were Trinidad instrumental dance music, which was syncopated in a style very similar to ragtime. And there again, that's something that very few people have delved into, because all throughout the Caribbean, Central and South America, there was music that corresponded with ragtime. It was syncopated instrumental dance music, and they just called it by different names. In Trinidad, they called them paseos. This group isn't quite strings. I put them in. I was going to use an example. They're from the island of Martinique in the Caribbean, French group, and they actually recorded a rag, and it was, strangely enough, a version of Tickled to Death by Charles Hunter, Nashville, Tennessee composer. Where they learned it, I don't know, but on the label it was in French, and the title meant something about a snake. So. Okay, we get into the revival of string bands, or ragtime string bands, if such a thing exists. This is the 6 and 7/8 string band from New Orleans, and technically speaking, they're not really revivalists, because you can see from this picture they were around in the actual ragtime days and the teens playing in New Orleans. And by the 40s and 50s, they had skimmed down to maybe 4 or 5 original members. But they did make some recordings, which were eventually acquired by Folkways label and put out. And they played the authentic style. In some places, maybe they jazzed it up a little bit, but it definitely helped keep the ball going for this type of stuff, because they definitely weren't playing the old-time type of string music, the mountain music. This is another important group. This is Dave Van Ronk's Ragtime Jug Stompers. They probably did the first recordings in modern times of rags. In the 60s on an album they did. They did Temptation Rag, St. Louis Tickle, and Georgia Camp Meeting, and played in a fairly authentic style. They included the jug player Sam Charters, who was a well-known writer on blues. And other than that, there hasn't been too much of an interest in the revival of ragtime string band music other than our group and Clark's group, the Skirt Lifters. I always thought there would be, and that more people would come along, because it was definitely an actual part. I also forgot to mention the Osmond Dudley Trio, which was Bess Osmond, Audley Dudley, a mandolin player, and Booten, who recorded ragtime on strings. They were possibly one of the earliest string bands to record, probably the first to record ragtime. And I could go on for another couple hours, but I'm out of time.
Questions? Yes, Dennis?
Yeah, what was the date of the Trinidad band?
1912, I think, as far as I know.
Where did you recordings of that?
There is a album from England, I believe. There's a whole series of albums that are like hot dance and jazz music from various countries, and there's one devoted to Trinidad. Another interesting thing about Trinidad is that they had a black pianist from there named Lionel Belasco, who played ragtime and wrote ragtime, and apparently recorded the first version of a Scott Joplin rag that was not issued. In fact, he may have known Scott Joplin. Maybe, do you know anything about Lionel Belasco?
No. Further questions? Here's one.
Well, it's funny because in the 20s, when everybody else had forgotten ragtime, it seemed like the only people that were playing it and recording it were string bands, because most of the recordings done in the 20s of rags are all by string bands, which by then was already completely dated and old-fashioned. And now it's mostly pianists. Some orchestras are starting to come around.
I think there's been a continuous tradition of string band ragtime. The country western, Bob Wills tradition.
Yeah, I was going to mention the Western Swing, which I had talked to Naki Parker before he died. He was a member of the Light Crust Doughboys, which was an old Western swing band. He had told me that they used to play the Dill Pickles rag. They featured their guitarist on that. He also told me they played a Charlie Johnson waltz, which nobody plays, one of his fairy waltzes. And a lot of the fiddling technique in Western swing seems to be derived from some of the typical ragtime figurations that on a piano are no big problem, but they had to develop special techniques to play some of that stuff on the violin.